Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Everett. Yeah, it's cool stuff. So I'm Pablo. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Durham University, and also leading the Journal of Business Venturing Insights since January 2022. Cool that we have people from everywhere, right? So this is amazing, right? So this is the new scholars community. So I thought, well, maybe it's a good idea to start with a reflection on where I was like. I guess when I was in your position, I read like a few years ago, right? So and I didn't have a really clear plan on what I wanted to do, a very broad research philosophy, and I guess that's how most PhD students start with, right? So they want to do interesting stuff generally that hopefully will help someone, right? People, the world. PhD students are normally trying to change the world, right? So that's a big idea, and that's where they normally struggle with at the beginning. And hopefully with nice people, right? So with your mates, with people where you change us, you kind of share the same concerns, right? And gradually over the years, that kind of very broad research philosophy took me to thinking about impact, right? And the contribution we're making in the world, right? And as we are progressing through our careers, every time you submit a paper, always kind of being asked, prompted to explain what's your contribution, right? It's always that sort of a what's your contribution. So inevitably you end up in that situation, right? So in thinking about what it means making a contribution, and in my case, I guess thinking about what it means being a contribution, right? So we, unlike the STEM disciplines, right, where you have an IP and something that you can pack, right? Our knowledge, it kind of goes with us everywhere we go, right? So every time you engage in a conversation, you're being a contribution, right? Just because you're there and you're sort of explaining your research somehow, right, to different audiences. And that obviously inevitably takes you to, as you're engaging with different audiences and what it means our research beyond our sort of little domains, beyond our social sciences and beyond the world of academia, right? And I always do this, right? And probably there's people who've seen my presentation before, they've seen these slides that I keep updating, right, every year, and numbers are not improving, right, at all, in the sense of how little the impact of academic work is within our communities and beyond our communities, right? So where normally the KPIs we use to assess our impact within academia are very poor, at least the results are very poor, right? In terms of citations, in terms of readership, in terms of, okay, what happens, right, once the paper's been published, which is frustrating, right, given the amount of time we spend working on our projects and trying to get our publications out. And it's an issue as well, because once the publication is out, we tend to forget, right? And actually after 4 years of trying to get some of that paper out, the first thing you want to do is forget about the paper. It's already a pain, right? So the stop ends there, and very little happens with that paper, right? So the impact of the work we do within our community is minuscule, and imagine the impact we're having outside our world, which is virtually non-existent. And that's a shame, right? And actually, it's very frustrating because we do good work, right? I'm not saying that we don't. We do very, very good work, and it's this sort of hard-won insights, right? And findings and theories where we explain the world. They end up trapped, right, in a lexicon that is very specific, that is sometimes impenetrable, and normally behind paywalls. That's also another problem, right? So we publish and say, okay, here's my research, and from the outside, it's impossible to access that piece of research. And actually, if you want to share that paper, you're violating some laws, right? Because you're not supposed to do that. People are supposed to pay to be able to access your research. So it's very frustrating, right? And we end up in a situation where we are living in an unreal world, right? So when you talk with practitioners, there's the real world, and then there's the world of academia. And that's odd, right? Because I personally feel that I'm living in a very real world, right? I'm aware of what's going on. I have a chat with friends that are not academics, and So yeah, it's weird, right? That dichotomy between the real world and the world of academia. It's I don't know. It feels weird. It feels very weird, right? For those in the UK, this will make sense. For those outside UK, I think it makes sense to explain a bit the call for research impact, and this is something that started 15 years ago, 20 years ago in the UK. It's a way of improving accountability in academia, and where universities have to show the contribution they're making to society and the economy, right? So here's a few definitions by the Research Council's UK, where the assessment of our work is not only based on our publications, but also on the effects, the change or benefit our research is having on society, on the economy, public policy, health, environment, quality, services, everything beyond academia, right? So, and that's something that we have to document and then we have to report. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how that works, but essentially it's changing the rules of the game, right? It started in 2014, growing in 2021, and everything says that it'll carry on growing for our next assessment in 2027, right? So impact beyond academia, it's important. And what is critical here, and this is that there's nothing to do with, or very little to do with, what the researcher believes his research is or can be useful for, right? So when we think about practical impact, right, immediately we go to that practical implication section, and that's a statement of what we think our research can be useful for, right? So here we're talking about the actual impact of our work. And that's something that we have to show with evidence that that impact's being produced, right? So again, changing the rules of the game. So at least in our setting, the impact agenda is taking center stage. I've traveled around, and that's something that's gradually being considered by universities in Europe and the US and Latin America. So it was kind of a thinking about either because there's commitment to society or to sort of advancing societal issues, or because there's governments on top of universities kind of trying them to show that the work they do is actually relevant, right? There's value for money in the work they do. So it's taking certain stage, it's changing institutional structures, changing incentive systems. So we now have hours in our workloads to do impact work. Funding allocation is largely based on whether that can be turned into impactful research. And it changes sort of the views on academic accountability and social sciences more broadly, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening in this phase where we're seeing that impact is playing an important role. And we've done a lot of progress, right? So in a few areas. So we know what counts as impact, we know how to report it, we know how to see it. And although there are many problems in causal attribution, right? We know what counts as impact, right? And we know what to do once the research output has been produced. I mean, impact has to be linked to research output. So there's a publication leading to impact, and we sort of know what to do. So we have opportunities to get train on how to engage with the parliament, how to engage with journalists, how to turn our academic work into pieces of text that can be read by external audiences, and so on. So there's a lot of training and available and funding available so that we can move our research outputs into the world of practice, policy, and so on, right? And that's what we normally do, right? So we change the lexicon, we change the activities, we change the outlets, and it's all packed in a concept, either engagement or reaching out, right? So we engage in certain activities to be able to reach out and engage with external stakeholders. So there are a few problems with scholarly impact, right? So let me just give you three ideas, kind of three layers of problems, right? The first is a bunch of problems, specifically in management research. I mean, it's not unique to it, right? But we're seeing it. Well, I guess I'm seeing it because I'm part of it. So one, they call it the problem of temporal succession, where we have a solution to a problem that we don't very clear what that problem is, right? So it's like the hammer and the nail. We have a hammer, which is our academic output, our paper, and then we're trying to find a nail, right, to hammer, and that's not a very efficient way of thinking about impact, right? Because you need to travel the world trying to find a problem to solve. I guess it makes sense to start with the problem, and then there will be a piece of research that can solve that problem. Then there's the problem of interesting and how we assess the value of an academic output. Normally, if something is interesting if it can expand theory, or something is interesting, or a problem can be deemed as interesting if it can support theory. And that sort of affects the way our work is being assessed, right? Kind of it narrows down how our work is being assessed. There's also a problem of language, where we have a different lexicon, right? So we have practitioners have a means-ends language, right? So there's a problem, here's a solution. Whereas we work in a language of relationships, there's a cause and effect, and that means that we work in a space of gaps and contributions, right? So again, if you think about those sort of four elements, they all work in different spaces, right? Gap, contribution, and relationships, and that in our side. Solution problems, so problem solutions and means and ends relationships in the world of practice are completely different. And the fourth problem is the problem with explaining the past, where we as academics, we are doing our work today, but we always be looking to the past and search for solutions, right? And under the assumption that history repeats itself, we can predict what might happen tomorrow, and that's what we do, right? So we explain based on past observations, whereas practitioners, they normally are future-oriented individuals, so they're creating the future they operate in. So thinking about entrepreneurs, the way I live in, these are world creators, right? They're creating businesses normally out of nowhere. And then that means that they're inventing reality, and it's always, right, thinking about, so always that with that future orientation, right? So that puts us in different temporal spaces, right? As looking into the past in search for explanations, practitioners thinking about the future and how that future can be better constructed, right? So then the second layer of complication is one where we have a missing bit, right? So where our practical implications are mostly based on speculative work. So we frame it as something that can eventually happen, but we never do research in between the two. We never do research in between the research we do and the world of practice, right? So as a way of making sure that the application of our knowledge is the best use, right, of our knowledge in that particular context. So we never engage in that little bit of research, right? So when biomedical science, for example, is doing amazing work, right? So there's the basic science being produced in the lab, then they engage in many processes of making sure that the application of that basic science knowledge is useful and is relevant, right? And actually is the best use of it in a particular setting, right? So inevitably, the recommendations we make to practice or policy for those hard-won pieces of knowledge, like theories, they end up in that sort of a space of informed speculation. And then there's a third problem, which is it's inherent to the work we do and when we move to try and engage with impact, right? So we currently live in this space where we work in detecting and explaining the differences, right? So we go to practice to identify difference in the world, go back to our world of theory, try and explain those differences in the world, and do that through abstraction, right? We theorize and then we test, right? And we live in a fairly stable space, right? And we're getting very good at it, right? So we do that all the time. We test, we theorize, we test and theorize, right? And repeatedly identifying and explaining differences. And now in management, we've done it so well that we can we can see our journals and what we do very close to what all the social sciences do, right? Very mature, as sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so on, right? So we see our social sciences in eye to eye, if you like, right? But we're seeing that all disciplines, all social sciences have done sort of those sort of moves to try and engage with the world, and we see that that's where we are now. So psychology went through it in the early 1900s, right, evolving into applied psychology or clinical psychology or counseling. Social sociology did so, and also like early 1900s moving to action sociology, social work, applied sociology. So we're seeing all fields moving in that direction, and we started looking into the why, right? They were moving in that direction. Sort of a quick review and identify that there was the orientation to tackle problems, right, and trying to make a difference in the world. And within it, there was massive amounts of wake-up calls, right, to try and balance rigor and relevance. I guess this New Scholars Network is part of that, right? It's part of that movement we're seeing in management scholarship, to try and turn the knowledge we produce into something that can be useful for practice, right? And we see a statement in the community supporting, for example, action anthropology, when they say, well, we're going to solve real world problems by using anthropological methods and idea, right? So there's always that orientation to try and engage with the world. And with in our space, with the crisis of management studies, and all the repeated calls in our journals, and again, this same network and so on, we're seeing that it's happening today in management, right? So you have this sort of impact movement, frustration, new scholars, right, engage with rigor and relevance, trying to keep that in balance. We have calls in the journal, so there's a lot going on, right? To say, well, this is the right time to engage in this space. But that adds an interesting complication, because that means that we need to start making a difference, right? Instead of explaining, detecting, we also need to start making a difference in the world. And that takes us from what in physics is called a two-body problem, fairly stable, to the three-body problem, right? And a three-body problem is something like that, right? Unpredictable mess, essentially, right? We don't know where it's going to go because it involves three moving elements, right, that interact and can move in many different directions, right? So we are stepping outside our area of comfort to try and make a difference. And instead of testing and theorizing, that means that we need to engage in other type of activities. We need to start designing, interviewing, evaluating, learning. And we are very rarely rewarded for doing that type of work, right? So you submit a paper to the journal. Normally the requirement is to make a theoretical contribution, right? If you're interviewing, you're learning, you're evaluating, that's very unlikely to lead to a theoretical contribution. Therefore, it's very unlikely that you're going to end up publishing that type of work. And not surprisingly, especially early career scholars are being discouraged from doing that type of work, right? Because it's very difficult that you'll be able to advance your career making a difference. Yeah, because it essentially involves doing different things, spending your time doing things that you're not supposed to be doing, right? So I'll take you through our first attempt to try and solve that problem, and I think we advance a bit, and then the second attempt, which is what was promised in the abstract you all received. So our first attempt was to try and turn to solution-oriented social science, right? To propose a shift in perspective, and thinking about that divide between research and practice, right? And when I talk about spending time doing things you're not supposed to be doing, it means that we will be spending time producing knowledge with an utility that is not valued in our environment, right? So the knowledge we produce can have multiple utilities. The utilities needed needed by practitioners is called practical utilities, right? Something that can be instrumental value for human activity. Whereas the work would be rewarded for is one that delivers epistemic utility, right? Something that is true, something that advances our knowledge. And they normally don't talk very well to each other, right? So we need that sort of a transformation, how we move from epistemic utilities to practical utilities, right? That we can deliver actually instrumental value through our research, right? And try and turn the table a bit and how and what it means interesting, right? And when a theory can be deemed as interesting. And instead of taking a theory or evaluating a theory as interesting, if it can be used to inform and solve a problem, we can just turn it in and put the problem as a starting point, right? So the idea of solution-oriented social science is one that actually tackles real-life problems, right? And uses theory, uses research to be able to do so. So we started looking into this space in between the two, right? So that space of informed speculation and what can be done instead, right? And what we propose is and I guess in our first attempt was a new research ecology, right? So systematic research efforts to ensure that the outcome of our basic science can be understood, can be adopted, or adopted by stakeholders in the best way possible, right? So instead of just throwing rocks into practitioners, right? So our bricks, right? Our papers, and hope, with the hope that they will be able to do something with it, do research, right? So that throw ends up in the right place. And that means that we need to move from that requires a translation, right? From description, explanation, that the elements we work with of our social sciences into elements of design, right? Prescription, and normative framework, technical norms, right? So what we did, we borrowed from, so we found inspiration in an initiative we launched back in 2019, called the Rapid Response Initiative. And which essentially what we're trying to promote is the use of translational science, right? So you take what already exists and you can quickly articulate that in a way that can be responsive to problems of practice, right? It's still work, it's still rigorous because it's based on research that's been done in the past, but it's packed in a way that knowledge can be conducted to practical solutions, right? And then, well, the initiative has been very successful. And we published, I think, 8 articles so far, 8, and we have a few more in review. But that essentially works with that, right? So translational science, and it works with the notion of rapid funding, rapid response funding. So borrowing or inspired by that idea, we went to biomedical sciences, right? And how they, no, it's not ground theory, no, it's not ground theory. It's a translational science, right? So this is what biomedical sciences do, right? So we have the basic science research, which is the equivalent to our research, right? So they develop in the lab, right? They develop knowledge of molecules or around molecules, genes, and so on, and they provide that knowledge so that then the biomedical sciences broadly can use that knowledge being produced, right? And we live in that T0. Our research, we define mechanisms, we define sort of like relationships, so how things work, but we don't really tell how could these things be used to solve a given problem. So biomedical sciences, they have that ecosystem, right? So they have the T1, the T2, T3, and have a final evaluation in T4, where they move that basic research to humans. So whether this thing can work in humans, can be then turned into treatments, right? And whether that would be work in patients or certain types of patients. So 2 types of clinical trials. And if we've all been seeing the news over the past 2 years, we heard a lot about clinical trials, right? Being sped up to try and get the vaccine out. Then the translation to practice, whether that can be turned or can be sort of a scale up, right, to treatments amongst different communities. And then there's an evaluation, right? So it's population health. Is this contributing to population health as a whole, right? And that's seen as a wide research effort, systematic research efforts of trying to move basic science, right? It's called the bench to bedside, right, of the patient, right? So we start with a bench in the lab and we end up right next to the patients providing care. And that's what biomedical sciences do, right? And we're very relatively well-oiled system to improve the health of the public, right? So it was challenging to move this to our space in entrepreneurship, but we borrow from this and then from design sciences to say, well, okay, there's a way of gradually moving this, thinking about the communities we normally engage with and the activities that are part of what design or part of design sciences, right? And we came up with this first, right? So with our sort of in the left-hand side of the model, as developing kind of paying attention to representations of reality, chance of reality, doing basic science and communicating to our scholarly communities, our insights, our findings, our theories, and they're circling back, right? In that identifying and explaining differences, right? But then there's and within that, that's the space of the natural, right? So we observe what exists. And what we do, we describe, we explain, we predict, and this is the functions of academic research. But the other things that we can do, right, to try and move to and engage with the different stakeholders we normally engage with, right, with the entrepreneurs themselves, with the support organizations, and with policymakers. And then say, well, let's use design science and what design sciences do. They frame, they experiment, they interact, right? So we can set different domains and different scientific domains, right, that can allow us to engage with practice and with communities, right, with entrepreneurs, practicing entrepreneurs, communities, and policymakers, and work around what they need, right? So entrepreneurs, they need methods, models, they need practices. Communities, right, say thinking about support organizations, networks around entrepreneurs. They work with meetings, they work with support norms, their ways of building relationships, why and what they use to improve support for practicing entrepreneurs. And then there's a world of policymakers. They work with narrative, they work with goals, they work with incentives. So we have three levels, right, of interactions and things that we can improve through our research. And in this first attempt, we propose, we elaborate on this idea of we research to propose some sort of entrepreneurial science, right? So that with the idea of sciences of the artificial, that we're essentially, every time we conduct research and say we interact with entrepreneurs, these entrepreneurs are building, creating new worlds, we are creating new worlds with them anyways, right? And we're improving practice and methods and models regardless. The second level, we borrow from community science as a contextualized form of citizen science, to be able to open a space where we can work with support organizations in a way that can be conducive to the development of new meaning, support norms, and relationships. And the final one is it's a subset of policy science. Is a child of policy science and design science, if you like, which is the experimentation with policy. So you open this sort of little spaces where you can develop, improve, and experiment with new narratives, goals, and incentives, and see how they work, whether they promote entrepreneurship in a different way, right? So that was our first attempt at trying to bring biomedical sciences into our social sciences and use it productively in entrepreneurship. But we were facing a lot of problems, right? So, I mean, broadly speaking, you say, well, this is a solution-oriented research process for which discovery theories made in basic research can be moved to practice, right? So people can make use of it, transform it, and adapt it. And at the same time, you will be advancing theory anyways, right? So you're changing meaning, you're creating a new reality. As you're creating a new reality, you can go and understand that reality well, right? And that can refine your models and your thinking. Anyway, so there's some recursivity there, right? But we realized there were a few issues with it, right? We don't think that it's risky, right? So if you say, well, okay, you're an early career researcher, go and use this, right? We don't think it's risky, right? Or problematic, right? So if you kind of take a look at what the vaccine teams did, right, all over the world. They were using knowledge that already existed, right? So none of what the Oxford vaccine team worked with was basic research. They didn't do any basic research, right? They see kind of proteins, monkeys, and other things, right? Everything was really combined and turned into a vaccine. And I think there's very likely that they'll get the Nobel Prize, right, for contribution to knowledge. And really, everything was already available. So there's no theory developed around the Oxford vaccine. There's knowledge being developed of how those things can be assembled, right? But there's no basic research done. But nonetheless, we suspect that can be seen as, we understand that can be seen as problematic, right, or risky. given where we live, right? We live in our academic communities, we live in our institutions, that's where our salaries are coming from. And if you want to progress in your careers, possibly you won't get promoted or you'll be able to progress in your careers doing this sort of research, right? Because it's normally thought of as a very applied type of research. And you may think, well, this is unlikely to lead to a research paper that I could potentially publish, in whatever 4-star or FT 50 or whatever you want to publish your work. And that means that there are a lot of institutional barriers, right? Because the incentive systems like work in a way that is not conducive, right, to do this sort of work. It was challenging to do the translation from biomedical sciences. Biomedical sciences, they have a fairly unified language of genes or proteins, and in every place you move, right, throughout that chain is the same language, right? Imagine taking identity in our basic research, right? It was struggle to move identity, right, from one room to the other without kind of creating friction. Imagine moving the word identity, right, throughout communities, policymakers, and support organizations. It's a mess. So since we don't have that unified language, we need to embrace contextualization and perspectivism, and that's very challenging, right, because that goes against generalizability. And that's another problem, right? Because things become too narrow, too specific, and too subjective. And people might see that as problematic. And that takes us into the other space, right, on what it means to make a contribution in our world of journals, that they're not perhaps or still not particularly open to applied work or work that can be conducted to practical applications, right? Apart from Business Horizons and California Management Review and Sloan and so on, right? But those are not the ones that you aspire to publish, right? Normally, right? Because that would go against your promotion and progression. So it's a tricky thing to break, right? And the other problem with using biomedical science is something from the natural sciences, right, and bringing it into social science, that we realized that we were downplaying the generative potential of social sciences, right? So I always use the same example, it's brilliant, right? So if you read in the news, coffee causes cancer, right? And there's a theory, right, explaining that coffee causes cancer, right? And that's communication of science, right? It's likely that the consumption of coffee will reduce, right? So you change in reality as you're explaining how things work. Right, and then a few months after, well, coffee cures cancer, right, or prevents, right, cancer. All of a sudden, coffee intake begins to grow again, right? So your social sciences, as we are explaining what's going on, well, that's an example from biomedical sciences again, right? But so we can find examples on fair trade, for example, like fair trade certification make a difference. Well, we go and buy fair trade certified products. Then there's a new piece of research saying, well, it doesn't make a difference, and actually it's damaging for local communities, so we stop buying from them. So you're altering reality, right? So as we're explaining the world, we're changing the world, right? And so, okay, why don't we embrace that more fully? So we move to our second attempt, right? And before engaging with my second attempt, are there any questions? Clarification that might be needed?
Pablo, if I may,
yeah,
just a question on what you covered so far. You talked about, kind of introducing a research framework for how to make research more impactful.
Yeah.
Like, apart from the research framework itself, I mean, are there practices that scholars can engage in that can also help drive impact, so to speak, or because the insights and ideas that they generate through their research work, apart from the way research is conducted, in your view, anything else we could do, maybe particularly touching on your point around problem-driven research, and how we learn that research and then go back to practice, so to speak, with those ideas and insights?
So the framework as a whole is it's a universe of designs and or ecosystem of designs that can be used in a way that the research we do is conducive to, but more likely to lead to that, right? Or a knowledge product that is both rigorous and relevant, right? But if you want to like go back to simple things, very simple things, pay attention to problems, right? So we do that very, very rarely. So we go, in a conference, right, and you start like playing with ideas. It's normally ideas and through a research process, right? So okay, this is what I think. This is how I think the world works. This is what I think is relevant to study, right? And it's always to do with, is this fine, right? To do with your own curiosity and your own perceptions of the world. Yeah, it's engaged scholarship, Van de Vensford, right? But it's a bit more than that, Jeffrey. But it's largely inspired by engaged scholarship, right? But you'll see that there are a few things missing, and we're trying to add to that work. Start with problems. So we launched an initiative now in the journal called Entrepreneurial Problems, so that scholars can do descriptive work. That's not very open, right? To doing descriptive work, and descriptive work is needed to describe how the world works, right? And that special issue is about entrepreneurial problems, right? So we open a space for people to explain what is the problem and what is an entrepreneurial problem. So we assume that there are issues with self-efficacy, we assume that there are issues with optimism, we assume there are issues, right? But those are assumptions, right? Sometimes you go out and ask, maybe those are not problems, right? We don't just really know. So I guess engaging with problems, is a good starting point, right? So step outside and do a bit of asking and conducting research on what a problem might be, right? And trying to formulate it with them instead of just yourself. Because what comes next is, okay, you go and engage, you do some sort of a consultancy, or sort of not consultancy, sometimes consultation, right? You gather some thoughts from practitioners, and you go back and you map it, right, based on your understanding of the world. But you very rarely engage in a process whereby you can actually formulate problems with practitioners, right? So to identify something that is meaningful to both of us. So that's another starting point, right? And I guess all begins with that and engagement. So anyways, any other question?
Yeah, this is Ravi Chinta from Washington, D.C. I want to bring two schools of thought here. One is theory-driven action, and Kurt Lewin famously said, the theory is the best action. That's one school of thought. You guide your actions based on reliable, prior, proven theories, which are already there. Otherwise, you're foolish to do something new. The other school of thought is action-driven theory, which you seem to suggest. And that is very useful when there is no prior reliable theory to guide you. And there's a whole basis for that. The grounded theory by Glaser and Strauss says you begin with problem identification because there is no prior theory to define that, and then you try to develop action-based theories. So you seem to be falling in that camp number 2. But while you're saying that, and I totally agree with you when there is no prior theory to guide you. So how do you choose between theory-based action versus action-based theory?
So this work is inevitably inspired by Levin's, right? So and try and see how a theory can lead to action. And then there's a sort of a saying, well, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Yeah, it's largely inspired by that. So we've been borrowed from those ideas as well. It is inspired by what is coming from with participatory action research, right? So and in the origins of action research and actually the limitations of action research and how it's currently practiced. So there's a lot of what you're referring to in this work, right? So you're always building on someone else's shoulder. So those school of thoughts are well represented in this work. We're trying to see, well, what are the limitations of what's been done, and okay, is there any way that we can try and resolve that, right? Because if you think about, for example, well, generally engaged scholarship, right? So, or action research. If you go to, at least by my experience, right? So doctoral training and the advice doctoral students receive is don't do that, right? Not in a million years, right? And there's focus on your research, theoretically relevant, but you can make a theoretical contribution through action research. You're not going to get where you want to go, what you need, what you would like to get. So I think that's and probably is fair enough, right? Because that's how the system works, right? So perhaps doing action research, you'll can develop a very a meaningful career, but it's unlikely that you'll get the publication that we rewarded for based on that. But there have to be a solution somewhere, right? Where we can do that and do the other thing at the same time, right? Because they're not I mean, science is to support life and society, right? So there has to be a way of reconciling the two, and that's where we're trying to do work, right? And see, okay, how can we not see this as a trade-off? How can we train people, like meaning doctoral students, so that they don't see this as problematic, right? So that they have to abandon some efforts because they need to focus on their careers, and their careers meaning that they have to spend years looking into the disciplines, right, and not outside to be able to produce something that might be meaningful for the academic community. So that's what we're trying to do, and yes, we're borrowing from those school of thoughts, right? Certainly. Should I carry on? Albert. Right. So second attempt. So when we started looking into those issues, right? So of incentives and systems, and how it might be fairly so, right? So seen as problematic or risky. We say, okay, let's take a step back and start thinking about examining, right? So what is at the core? And as I was just mentioning before, what is at the core of that trade-off? Right, at the core of that requisite practice gap, and what that requisite practice gap means, right? And why is so persistent, right? Why it's so difficult to break, right, or to find a space that is meaningful in between the two, and we think, well, first of all, it's the gap and the bridge. A gap is a breaking continuity, right? So you kind of search up what a gap is. It's a breaking continuity. It's a void. It's a space with no matter inside of it, right? And the bridge is something that we use to transport things, right? So there's nothing happening in the structure of a bridge. It's just a structure. It doesn't move anywhere, right? And there's that imposes a dualism, right, between theory and practice that constrains the separate solution, because the only possibility to cover a breaking continuity is to set a structure where we can transfer things, right? But we never stop to think, okay, is there movement in that space? Right? Is there something that we can do with that space, or think that space differently, right? So that there's no dualism between theory and practice, right? Because that dualism is it's living as kind of you see in the TikToks, it's living for free in our minds, right? So it's there and prevailing, and well, so far. Then the other problem, the other issue is that practical problems are seen as too idiosyncratic, right? To be theoretically interesting. So if you go and ask, right? So we go back to this going around and asking what problems might be. It seems that the problems are too narrow, too specific to that reality, too specific to that particular entrepreneur, to that particular incubator, and therefore they're not theoretically interesting, right? Because they're so narrow. And sometimes most of those problems can be solved with solutions that already exist. But then when we say, okay, there's knowledge available that we can bring in to solve that particular problem, right? Our theoretical solutions are seen as too generic, right? To be practically meaningful, right? So we we're trying to have that conversation between narrow problem, idiosyncratic problem, and general theories. And that conversation is not happening, right? And it's difficult to happen, right? Because we have something that's too general to be able to meaningful, something that's very idiosyncratic. And that people, the issues that people are dealing with, right? They're too narrow and they're not interesting to us, right? Because it's unlikely that we'll be able to develop a general theory, right? On the back of something that is too narrow. And it might be affecting a small population, but it doesn't mean that it's irrelevant, right? Or not meaningful. But anyway, so we're sitting in that reality, and it's also the going back to my previous point. There's a tension between retrospective examination and prospective thinking, right? So as people are trying to invent the world, and in us, right? So looking backward. So we have that third person perspective, right, where we observe the world, right, as objective observance. And then there's the first person perspective of people living life, right, and changing things, right, and creating the world as time is moving forward. So that took us back to the making a difference and the mess of the body problem, right, and to engage with theory, because we say, well, if we're not going to be able to convince people to do actual research, and it's what we value instead of theory, well, let's try and leverage theory, right? That's what we need to keep at the core. We cannot remove theory from the core, and trying to explore, well, what else can theory do? Right, and that's it. That was an interesting challenge, right? Because, and that's something that normally engaged scholarship. So going back to one of those questions, right? Engaged scholarship or action research don't do, right? So they try and if anything, right, the message is, well, theory currently is too much of a good thing, so we need to abandon theory a bit, right, or stop overdoing theory, because that's where the problem is, right? And instead we say, well, perhaps there's a different answer to it, right? Why don't we try and leverage theory differently, and try to think about the generative potential of theory, right? Again, see, we have an explanation for why fair trade products can be damaging to people, right? That already has a generative potential, because can change the relationship we have with fair trade products, right? If we envision that relationship differently, right, we might be able to change that reality again, right? So there's something there in the different roles that theory can play that we might be able to solve the problem that we were dealing with in the first place, right? So instead of asking, so when we submit our papers, right, we get a rejection, we got the question, right, so what, right? And that's the question of interesting, of theory being interesting. So if we're going to explore the generative potential of theory, we thought, well, maybe there are other questions that we can use to evaluate a theory. So we can use a question such as what for, right? So what are we using this theory for? And what happens after we put that theory out, right? So when you say, well, this is how the work could work, and you explain relationships into the future, we can start thinking about, well, what might happen as a result of it, right? What is the DV that doesn't yet exist? And that's a theory provoking something, right? But the way we assess, obviously, we cannot assess that theory based on a so what question only, right? We need to add other evaluative questions to it, right? So what for and then what? So what we propose is, instead of bridging the gap, what we're trying to bring some action to the gap, right? Instead of seeing it as a no man's land, right? As a void, as that breaking continuity that needs to cross over. What are we seeing as a space where we can do things together, right? So let's jump into that sort of a gap together, practitioners and researchers, and trying to find a meeting point where we can engage in conceptual rigorous activities, right, and activities that also are conducive to practical input. So we can tackle things that are relevant and meaningful to both of us, and we can get our benefits, right? So because I've been doing this sort of research for years, right, and only lately I've engaged with practitioners with I want my papers. I love writing, right? And I like, right? I enjoy refining arguments, right? I don't want to abandon that, right? And please don't ask me to do consultancy work, because that's not what I'm good at, right? I love my research. So out of our collaboration, there has to be something meaningful for us as researchers as well, right? In the world we live in, and there have to be something meaningful for practitioners as well in the world they live in, right? So we should be able to produce something with epistemic and practical utilities. So instead of, from the research point of view, instead of going with a me search, right? So exploring questions in your own mind and curiosity and drivers, right, and motivation, or going into the they search, which is pretty much translational sciences. So you work around the needs other people have, which is the risk is that you end up doing consultancy work. What do we engage in this sort of a we search, right? Or we research, right? We can do stuff together, right? In a slightly different way, in putting whilst retaining theory at the core of that activity, right? And that's where we introduce this idea of prospective practical inquiry as a blueprint for this we search research, right? And we leverage two things, right? And this goes back to the question before, so I think Ravi's questions on that sort of disciplines and school of thoughts, and also engaged scholarship. So we're borrowing from co-creation, we're borrowing from prospection and prospective theorizing, but instead of moving, right, from epistemic and practical utilities, which is what we were trying to do before, why don't we leverage both the mutual value of epistemic and practical utilities, right? So there have to be something there, there have to be something in common, right? And how epistemic utilities are derived, and how practical utilities are constructed, right? So we kind of started building slowly, right, within sort of proposing a new infrastructure for new theorizing. So borrowing from, again, co-creation and prospection. So in co-creation, there's amazing work out there, right? So my sort of good friend Garima and there's Natalie, so I think in the audience with team and so on, they've done amazing work in co-creation. And I've been involved in that space as well, like trying to be in two spaces at the same time, right? So driving, explaining, and predicting, and also trying to help practitioners to inform, prescribe, and control what these guys do, right? And trying to find alignment between the two. But what research is telling us is that it's very difficult to do it, right? And actually it's virtually impossible. And that's in one of Garima's paper, right? It's virtually impossible to co-create knowledge that's both rigorous and relevant. And we feel that the problem is how co-creation it works, right? So you set up an artificial space where we meet, we're trying to align, we're trying to solve, and then we assess, right? But there's actors then retrieve, they don't carry on work together very rarely, right? So it's more in a consultation mode, and then we propose, and then they assess, right? So co-creation works upon normally deals, right? Transactions. So we align agendas, we set goals so that we can solve problems. We have episodic interactions that we feel that for mutual benefits, right? But there's never discussion of what is meaningful in that mutuality. And normally assessment is based on practical utility, and that's the issue, right? At least my experience being when my work is being assessed by practitioners, right? It's only assessed based on practical utilities. And then there's sensation, well, damn it, I would like to take this with me, right? And what we normally take from those instances, at least with research, is the data. Right? So that's the coin, right? I co-create, I help practitioners, and then what I get is data that I can take with me, and then I do my papers, right? But that means that this is time that you have to invest in building those relationships that might end up in good data, but it might not end up in good data, right? And that's a risk. So what these guys are doing, right? Co-creation is what they normally do. They're trying to find meaning within a space of shared inquiry. Within a space of inquiry. So there's that space, and then we go in there and we try and kind of take that space apart and bring to our domain wherever we feel it's relevant. We take data, they take advice, right? And probably I'm sort of illustrating too much that how co-creation works, but what the data is telling us is actually very difficult, right, and virtually impossible to create the knowledge that we want. So, and then we thought, well, why don't we, instead of trying to find share meaning with that space of inquiry that normally is retrospective, right? Why don't we try and do inquiry in a space of shared meaning? So why don't we create the space first, right? Something that we identify what is meaningful to both of us, right? So because there's a chance that there will be a knowledge production activity that can be conducted to practical utilities and epistemic utilities, right? But meaning needs to come fast, right? We need to find meaning and work meaning first and develop a sense of commitment to what we're doing before we can do research together, right? Otherwise, it's very difficult. You end up in this sort of tearing the space apart inevitably, right? So we started thinking about how can co-creation be used to solve problems, or how can we use it? How can we create something that is meaningful to both parties, and how can we unleash, right, the generative potential of co-creation? So that took us to the world of prospection and prospective theorizing. This is coming from Seligman's work from positive psychology and how the future can influence the present, right? So is the future pulling? So we aspire, we create a future, or images, representation of the future. We assess that future today, and then we move, right, and act in consequence, right? But what is interesting here, in every time, even in our daily lives, right, every time we create a representation of the future, we're creating something called if-then possibilities, right? If this happened, that happens, and that becomes a possibility, and we can act upon and evaluate, right, that future, if it's desirable, and that relationship holds, right, we can move in that direction. So it's a theory because it's an if-then relationship, right? So something happens, then something happens. It becomes a theory with the potential to change our behavior today, right? And that's the idea of prospective theory. And again, true to Ravi's comment, this is coming from a pressure inquiry, right? So that was a pressure inquiry. They borrowed from Seligman's work and try and bring that to fix the problems with action research, right? So we borrowed from that space and trying to marry that with co-creation and see, well, theory can play the role, right? It has a generative power, right? If you think about physical sciences, right? So astronomy, for example, they can explain the trajectory of the moon very, very well, right? But they cannot change it, right? And that's different in our case, right? In social sciences, we can explain things that might happen, and we can change that reality as a result of presenting those possibilities, right? So our theories have something that theories in the physical sciences don't. So we can turn something that is ideal for us, a desired future. So I see people in the space of sustainability, we're all desiring a different future, right? So we can think about the if-then possibilities of the future and see how can we create that world that we will then discover again. So we can do research on that world that is under emergence. So so in that sense, what we're trying to do is if you go back to theory, instead of using a theory in an interpretive manner, right, which is what we normally do. So we go and explain and describe, explain and predict, and that is an interpretation of the world, right? And then the explanation that comes, right? Theory can also be used in a creative way, right? To imagine, right? It's called discipline imagination, right? It's all structure imagination. And you can use it to create things, realities. And we can pre-experience those realities, right? So we can do that today. We can assess those realities because that's the capacity we have as humans, right? So we can evaluate future possibilities and then act upon those, right? So then we define prospective practical inquiry of this framework as the collective exploration, generation, and evaluation of alternatives to the present, and that comes in the form of theories for futures that we all aspire to collectively, right, with the people you work with, right? Those theories, and this is the beauty of it, those theories can be envisioned, so you can project them into the future, it can be shared, and we can experience this, right? So as the future is unfolding, and that could be then constitute the basis for new phenomenon that's under emergence, and that's a phenomenon that we can study. I've been exploring the space of mental health and entrepreneurship, right? And I'll kind of share an example in a second. And there are things that we don't do, say, for example, in incubation programs. We don't, normally incubation programs don't ask people to put together a well-being plan as part of a business plan, for example. And I was working with an incubator in Durham, and that came as part of the conversation. Said, what if we do that? And then immediately after, someone said, well, that might happen. That already became an even possibility in a theory of what might happen if we do that, right? And that a theory that can be actually elaborated as a proposition, right? If we add this plan, this might happen, and you can set conditions, set boundaries, so you can do what we do in our work. I mean, as we do it daily, right? The only thing is that you're operating in a space that doesn't yet exist. And those theories can be experienced, right? Because you can introduce, you can intervene with that theory, right, into that space and change reality as reality is emerging, right? The challenge is how to do it, right? And that we propose 3 elements, right, to be able to articulate that. So 1, mutually meaningful spaces. 2, research interventions. 3, reflection on emergent phenomenon, the phenomenon that's emerging. And in that sense, we can operate and connect what we do in retrospective theory-driven research, describe, explain, and predict, and the task plus practice, right? So they inform, prescribe, and control. That's where we can find that little space. So something like that, something like that. This is work in progress, by the way. It's under review at the minute. So if my reviewers in the audience, I already broke the blind review process, but so be it. So we have the sort of the 2 spaces of practice and research, right? And what we do in between is open that mutually meaningful space, right? So we can then, within that space, we generate, explore, and evaluate theories for that future. And that future realities as an emerging, we were enacting theory, right? So going back to that, let's put a well-being plan in a business plan, right? You can enact it. And then as that phenomenon is emerging, as people is using it, that can be, we can reflect in action or reflect on action, right? So we can learn as action is occurring, and we can learn as the action has occurred, right? And that feeds back into the mutual meaningful space where we can learn. And at the same time, as phenomenon is emerging, that could allow us to revise and validate together, right? The normative theories that we are using in our research. So there's, I mean, if you think about publication, there's the opportunity because you're essentially updating theories, right? Normative theories that inform our work. So, and obviously that would be affecting present reality as well. So, right. So, mutually meaningful spaces. That's something that I'm experiencing today. We have a working group with trying to develop a mutually meaningful space. It's very challenging. It's much more challenging than what we have in the paper, actually. But anyway, so we feel that knowledge, entrepreneurship knowledge, it always resides in interactive collectivity, right? So it's created, it's maintained, and is put to use by groups of people, researchers and practitioners. It's always circulating, right, in one way or another. So it's part of an interactive collectivity, whether you like it or not. So if that's the case, well, we have something in common then, right? And in our case, at least in entrepreneurship, we have value creation by human enterprise as something that we all care about. Entrepreneurs care about that. We care about that. That's the core of our research. That's the core of the practice. So that's already a space of shared meaning, right? The thing is that we need to adjust it, right, and refine it so that can we turn into something that can be we can act upon, right? And then we work on the idea of mutualism, where there have to be something beneficial for both. Collaboration is not necessarily, it doesn't derive mutual benefit, and co-creation, same thing, right? So it can be parasitic at the same time. So co-creation can be perfectly parasitic. So in that sense, we say, well, relationships need to be mediated by meaning. So you need to find something that is relevant and meaningful to both of us, right? And that requires a lot of conversation. And that needs to go beyond the deal constructed on the basis of instrumental value, right? So it's very difficult to resolve in one meeting. We say, okay, here's the combined agenda, here's our task, and then you just go ahead and try and do something with it, right? So that's a deal. You need to find something that's meaningful to both of us, and that requires kind of a breaking boundaries, kind of a vulnerability, and a lot of things that's very challenging to do for especially academics show vulnerabilities. So what we try and do here is try and discover is how we both see the world together, how we value the world, how we find meaning in the world, right? As we're trying to improve, right, the circumstances for the people we care about. In this case, in my case, my community of entrepreneurs. And to be able to do that, we need to do two things, right? So one is a joint reflection on common denominator. So essentially we have A, B's, and C's, right? So we have means, ends, relationships. We need to find what is common in those relationships, right? So they have to be in how things connect, things that we all care about. Because we need to find alignment between descriptive and prescriptive models. So we use different types of modeling, as I was explaining before. So we need to find that common blueprints that will allow us to operate together and create change. The issue is that once we find alignment and a common blueprint and a common model, right? Thinking about going back to that if-then possibility I mentioned before, that if-then possibility, those models, they lack self-revealing mechanism. They're not going to do anything by themselves. So we need to do something with those spaces, right? So instead of just staying with shared understanding and shared experiences, right, where okay, this is our problem domain, we share those experiences, there's some level of empathy, right? They know where I'm coming from, I know where they're coming from. We develop that common blueprint to make a change. We need to make it work. We need to activate it. So we need to move from shared understanding and shared experience to develop some sort of shared will, right? Common purpose. And that means that we want to do something together to solve this, right? And that's the propelling mechanisms that we need to inject into the work we do together, right? Because that will give thrust to the generation and use of perspective theory, right? With true generative power. Because otherwise models stay there, right? Oh, we all care about, we can map out the challenges, but it doesn't mean that something will happen as a result of it, right? So perspective theory will end up in evident possibilities that can be assessed, but nothing will happen as a result. Therefore, there's no impact, essentially, right? And then we went back. I mean, I'm not going to stay here, right? So we just went back, and the community is exactly the same, right? So we can create mutually meaningful spaces with entrepreneurs. We can create mutually meaningful spaces with support organizations and with policymakers. And the dialogues we're going to open with them, they're different. Right? I'm currently working with entrepreneurs, and clearly we're working around model, methods, practices, behaviors. But it would be different in the work we do with incubators, where they care about how we support, right? Requirements. Do we engage in conversations with investors, right? So what sort of training should we provide? So it's completely different type of conversation you should be having with both of them. But the process is then from then on is the same, right? Which is as follows. So the intervention is essentially that creating if-then possibility with generative potential, right? And it's the movement from creating to evaluating, sharing and experiencing those if-then possibilities, right? So instead of focusing on scholarship as an explanation, which is what we do day in, day out, which is the organization of facts, and where we model the world as is, we need to move to a type of scholarship that is called scholarship as intervention, right? Which is the generation of facts, right? A model for the world that it doesn't yet exist, and the world we aspire to have, right? And that's the creation of the possibility that can be turned into something real, right? So going from the ideal to real. So and what we feel is interesting here is that idea of scholarship as an intervention, where we devise theories for the future, and then there's a sort of a generation and testing of the possibility, it can deliver value for both, right? Because it delivers statements of future relationships anyways, that can be tested, that can be refined, and they can become a true representation of reality. So we have epistemic utility as a result of it, therefore satisfying the needs of researchers. And it also can deliver blueprints and technical norms that can improve practice, right? In a world that's being co-created. So therefore it satisfies the needs of practice, right? So it feels, at least we feel that there's a chance that we can do something in that gap, right? To action the gap that is no longer a trade-off, right? That it could be part of our daily work and could be conducive to practical impact at the same time. So, and as we bring in theory to the core of it, right? So our discussion of what makes a good theory, that needs to be adjusted or refined a bit, right? So if you go back to Kurt Levin's work, right, when he says, well, there's nothing as practical as a good theory, the question of what a theory is, right, in that sense, and how we evaluate the value of theory. And in this case, we say, well, there's theoretical value in this type of work because it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? It's provoking new possibilities, is explaining action or provoking action, right? It can stimulate normative dialogue. And in our case, how entrepreneurs, organizations, and policymakers can organize themselves toward that desired future, what they want to create, right? So it's valid academic work, right? And this is coming from Cooperwriter's work on prospective theorizing and the entire reflection on prescribe inquiry. So it's valid research, right? It's valid theorizing. So the question is, okay, what do we do then, right? Because there will be an existing reality in emergence. So if you go back to the origins of action research, where we say, well, if you're trying to understand something, well, try to change it, right? That changes, well, that would be, or should be treated as an emergent phenomenon, right? Constituting reality. So what we need to do is assess that reality is under emergence, because that's our DV in the end, right? So it's a DV that is emerging, so it's an outcome that is in the process of emergence. And we need to be able to reflect, right, whether our thinking, our models, how they interact with that world that's under emergence. And borrowing from Sean's work on reflective practice, we say, well, there are two things we can do. We can reflect in action. We're thinking about what we are doing. So we need that meta sort of assessment of our work and interaction with the world, right? So in my work in action research, I recruited part of the research team, my own psychologists, when they have their own psychologists, that type of thing, right? So I recruited a researcher to help me think about what I'm doing in my own research, right? So it's a researcher on top of the researcher. So because it's my conversation with reality, but as I'm part of that reality, it's really difficult to think through, right? Reflecting action is very challenging, right? So I need to be able to detach myself and see, okay, what is it happening? What can be happening, right, in this situation as the situation is unfolding? And it's been amazing, right? So having that sort of therapy, research therapy, right? Every time we engage in conversations and activities, I have my conversations with my other researcher, right? And she's coming from sociology, so it's completely different from detached from management. So we don't engage in management theorizing, right? It's just the reflection on, okay, what I'm doing, am I doing it correctly? What's happening in this reality that I'm seeing under emergence? And the second one is reflection on action, right? So it's that stepping mentally out of that process to evaluate the course, right? And what's resulting. Is it good, what I'm getting here, right? Is it bad? So we need to be an assessment of whether that desired reality is becoming the reality I was aspiring to create, right? Is it good or is it bad? So we can do both, reflect on inaction and reflection on the actions being committed, right? So this is just a quick example. This is a project we have in Durham, looking at mental health experience of entrepreneurs. And we wanted to develop not just a refined understanding of mental health experiences, but also develop an intervention, right, that we can use to mitigate the effects of engaging in entrepreneurial activity. So instead of doing traditionally, we say, okay, let's just go and try and address this issue head on. So we use participatory action research to like power our prospective practical inquiry. And so we kind of took another issues in consideration, issues of power and knowledge asymmetries, and how kind of skills are being used by practitioners and researchers and so on, right? So we put together a team of 12 researchers. We have 4 full-time researchers, professional researchers, 2 early career researchers. I think one of my early careers is in the audience, it seems. And we recruited 6 entrepreneurs, right? And we're entrepreneurs with a researcher salary. to become part of the team, as you would do in a participatory interaction research, right? And we engage with Durham City Incubators, our partner in crime. And the first phase, which is the first 6 months, is just to create that mutual meaningful space, right? And it's a bunch of workshops where we trying to take the entire group, me included, right? From not knowing each other to develop a shared understanding. So we engage in sort of a community mapping. So who is who, power, roles, what can they do about it? Reading group. So let's get a sense of what's in the literature. And what I did in this case, I got into a space I know about entrepreneurship, but nothing about mental health, right? So intentionally went into a space I have very little knowledge of. Therefore, I will be learning with the 6 entrepreneurs as a newbie, right? It was equally new to me. So when we got into the literature, it was new to all of us, right? So socializing knowledge, then trying to get a sense of reality, right? So trying to identify what problems are and sort of over time mapping and remapping literature and where are the overlaps between literature and practical experiences. Try to identify that sweet spot, right? So where we can act upon, there where we can develop practical utilities and semi utilities, right? And we have our last event in a couple of weeks' time, where we're going to try and envision, right, develop those if-then possibilities based on all the work we've done so far, and trying to map out intervention possibilities, right? So what can we intervene, right? If these are if-then possibilities, and then we assess them as valuable, what can we do with them, right, moving forward September after the summer? So we engage in that process. So we're living this framework slowly and reflecting in action on how things are evolving. So what we think we do with this piece of work and the sort of a collection of pieces of work, specifically the prospection thingy. So one, I think we provide a reframing of the idea of research practice gap, at least in our domain, entrepreneurship, to open a space for a new type of theorizing. We offer the framework where we feel that researchers and practitioners can work together and generate theories and use theories, right, for the construction of futures within spaces that are meaningful, where there's meaning for and value for both of the community, for both communities. And as we're doing that, we're creating a distinction in the creation of use of theory. So we're putting theory at the center, right? And we're leveraging both the interpretative and creative power of theory. Because we feel that the problem is not with the theory itself, right? Because that's where we're putting too much attention to say, well, there's too much of a good thing, right? We should be doing something else. There's abandoned theory in some cases, right? There's in my reading, I came across a few very critical articles, right? No academic articles, right, in the news, right? Well, we should bulldoze the business schools because they're completely irrelevant, right? So they do a lot of theory, but theory is going nowhere. So, well, no, it's not a problem with theory itself, right? The problem is with the intentionality for which the theory is developed, right? And how we assess theory and the value of theory. So what we're doing, we're adding these two new evaluative dimensions to the assessment of what a good theory is, what makes a good theory. So we bring some direction to it, what a theory is for, and consensuality, right? So what can we do with theory after it's been devised, right? So the idea of then what. And then we went back to the work of Watts and solution-oriented social science, and what they say, well, it's not about moving to action. Applied research, right? So solution-oriented research will happen when we manage to blur the boundaries between applied research and basic research. And we feel that this is what the space is doing, because it's open a space, and going back to one of the comments, it's open a space between reflective practice and engaged scholarship, right? So we feel that there's a space in the middle that hasn't been yet covered. And we offer this pathway to bridge relevance and rigor, and how theory can be used, right, to develop those blueprints for a different type of world, so we can solve problems, but get our products as well, right? So as we're reflecting on sort of discussing reflective practice from Sean's work, right? If you're familiar with reflective practice, right, Sean? What he was trying to do, he was trying to open a space for his fellow practitioners, right? He was a practitioner, not an academic, right? But he was very kind of intrigued and interested in how research works, and he thought, well, maybe there's something from there that we can bring into practice and turn it into more reflective practice. So what he was trying to do is talk to his fellow practitioners, right? For those of whom research function not as distraction from practice, but as a natural development of it, right? I guess we're trying to do the same in our own space. We're talking to people, our fellow scholars, right? Researchers, for whom practice function not as a distraction from research, right, but as a natural development of it. So that's my work, guys. I promise Brad, I will talk for less than the time I took, but anyway, so hopefully you'll like the work, and if you have any questions, right, obviously, I'm here to try to answer them.
Thank you, Pablo. I think whilst everyone is digesting what you've just shared with us, feel free to put up your virtual hand if you have any questions. In the meantime, maybe I could start off with one of the questions I had. I find fascinating as you try to work through and think about, kind of new models or new ways of thinking about doing research in the way that can be, in the spirit of engaged scholarship, can be helpful for practice and theory. But one thing I noticed, I suppose, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's very much kind of you maintaining your research identity, right? So you're not actually becoming a practitioner. You still, even though you're engaging deeply with practitioners, you're still maintaining your research identity.
Yeah.
And what I recall, I was trained as a doctor in the past, and a number of my friends were still in medicine and yet moved into research. What they actually do, they combine research and practice, right? So they still see patients,
yeah,
and at the same time they do research piece, and it's all part of one job, so to speak. It's not like they have two separate jobs. Is there a space for us to do that kind of work where we both maybe engaging more deeply with the practitioners, maybe involved in some sort of decision making, or contributing to the work of an organization, say, whilst at the same time doing research? Or we're not
yeah,
that
there's that space. Well, we might have different views, right? Because we call things differently, but that's normally the space of clinical scholarship, and that exists in management. Or sometimes professors of practice that they have a very they're very engaged with research. The problem is it's the value of the work that you can, the value we attribute to the work resulting from that type of work. A clinical researcher in medicine, right? If you go to a teaching hospital, that's what you will find, right? So clinicians that they do research and work with patients at the same time, right? But they're mostly on the, if you go back to the translation, right? So they're mostly on the T1, T2, right? So they're working with either clinical trials, they're working with patients, they're working with trying to see how knowledge that they're taking from was being produced in the lab, right? They're not lab people, they're very engaged, right? The thing is that the outcomes of a T1, T2, right? That's not something that we can publish in our journals, at least so far, right? In most of the journals, I guess we all aspire to publishing. And that's what is tricky. Therefore, when we have, say, positions open for clinical professors, you're not expecting that a clinical professor will play that role. Therefore, and in our world of hierarchies, right? So a research professor, I don't know, probably it's a different type of aspiration. If you're in a research track, not in a clinical track, at least in management, right? Or leadership track or teaching track. Research track is normally seen as, well, that's what we want to do, right? I want to stay, and that's what we're trying to do here, is work with the research identities. I'm going to retain that because I don't want to lose it, right? I don't need to lose it, and we're being asked to lose that when we're supposed to engage with practice. And why do I have to lose it? Right? I rather prefer to kind of sit in front of my practitioners, the entrepreneurs, and say, well, this is who I am. I'm a researcher. I want my papers. I love my papers, right? Don't ask me to abandon that. And I'm trying to make them as useful as possible. But I don't want to abandon that because I love that work. And that happens, I was just in a meeting before this one with kind of discussing commercialization of social sciences. And for someone who's coming from STEM and even in STEM disciplines, right, researchers, they say, well, there's an opportunity to create a business on the top of this IP, whatever knowledge. They say, well, no, I love my research, right? Why would I want? I mean, brilliant, but I love my research. I want to stay here, right? So that's the problem when you ask people to perhaps move too quickly to apply scholarship because there's so much to lose. That perhaps is better staying the other way, right? Anyways, there's Jasmine. Or from the hands I'm seeing, virtual hands.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. I found it really inspiring. Especially this prospective practical inquiry framework, what you presented, it caught my attention. As you said, like the research intervention and the phenomena influence each other. Like the research can also influence the phenomena. And as I'm doing research on environmental entrepreneurship, I feel like this is a phenomena which is pretty much emerging. And so I wondered whether, like, which are the ways which you encountered how research can influence practice? Because of course we all know the big economics theories which make like students think more like homo economicus or something, but like in this phenomena I always think about, is it policy or is it really educating like the entrepreneurs themselves? Because you have to have very specific channels, I guess, to do that feedback loop then.
Then the issue with that, I mean, we have good products, right? So the work we do, the theory we propose, even if they're retrospective or prospective, they're good stuff. The issue is what can they solve, right? Or what reality, whether the reality that can potentially construct is a desired reality. Because most of the work is coming from our own interest, right? So I'm interested in very weird things, but it doesn't mean that that would be attractive, appealing, or useful, right, to anyone outside my little brain. So that's what when we kind of started thinking about this, say, well, the first thing we need to do is open the spaces for mutual interaction, right? And that are mutually meaningful. Because then when you realize what can be valuable for both of us, right? And as different communities, and trying to identify problems where we can act upon together, right? And create a world that we both see that we can play a role in, right? Because we're at least, I mean, probably there's a lot of people in the room. So this is my experience that when you're kind of working in your theories and you have your beautiful papers, and then you see that that's not valuable to anyone, there's no value by anyone, right? Outside my domain. So, and if I turn to practice immediately, I'll be losing kind of a grounding in that sort of a general theories, and perhaps what we're going to be dealing with is too idiosyncratic, so it's no longer relevant to what I was planning to do. So, so that's why I think that the opening of those spaces, right, of mutual meaning are so relevant, and it takes a huge amount of time. That's the thing, right? And that's, I think, what we need to. If there's something I've learned is those relationships, and to open kind of meaningful relationships as in any aspect of life, right? When you want to have kind of develop a friendship, it takes a huge amount of time and effort, and there's no data there immediately, right? So there's nothing that you can take away from that relationship right away. So it takes months and months and months and months of trying to build something that we all and conflicts and tensions and again, I mean, it's disclosure and vulnerability is a big issue, right? So because you need to tell them where you're coming from, there needs to be a space of empathy, right? Whereas you say, well, this is what I want, this is what I need, this is, and if we're going to do something that it's meaningful for both of us, meaning practice and research, we need to have that sort of openness. And it's difficult, right, for people who own knowledge, right? And that's what we have, right? So we own knowledge, and we own knowledge production mechanism as researchers. So we have that power. If you present yourself as someone that's vulnerable with no knowledge, right? Or these are all my concerns, these are all my fears, you're giving away what it makes you distinct as researcher, right? So that's the ownership of knowledge. So that's very difficult to do as well. So I'm not asking something simple to do. There are a lot of tasks involved, but it's cool. It's cool. Ravi?
Yeah, I just first of all wanted to commend you for an excellent presentation. It's really par excellence, really, really good. And thank you for sharing your experiences. I just want to bring in a little bit of defense on the theory to action side, which most of us do. And you're promoting action to theory side, and both are important. And I really like your presentation because you're giving emphasis to something that's largely ignored by the existing scholars in academia. So I really commend you to really think about this action-oriented theory development, and that's really good. But in defense of theory to action, much of what you see in academic publications is really revisionistic, meaning trying to look at how the existing theories can be modified and revised based on trying to explain the new anomalies that are appearing in reality. So the old theories, and I'm trying to bring in Kuhn's scientific revolution idea here. All hypotheses are falsifiable, and if you find new data, new reality that the existing theory cannot explain, then you revise the existing theory. So a lot of moral responsibility rests on the shoulders of academics who do the theory to action in a way to revise existing theories. Otherwise, people will be using wrong guidance to act. So I'm trying to defend the other part. Theory to action is as important as action-driven research, which is what you're promoting. And much of what you said is also very much stressed in grounded theory when there's no existing prior reliable, proven, demonstrable theory to go by. Then you start with the real grounded theory, action to theory development. That's all I wanted to say. And thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess there's like difference is in how those theories are devised, right? So you can look into the past and try and explain, even if it's grounded, right? So you say, okay, let's observe and build from the ground up, right? And an explanation for why might be going on. Here's an invitation to look into the future, because that's where practitioners are looking into, right? They're obviously assisted by knowledge that already exists, but they're creating worlds, right? As they're progressing, they're working for tomorrow, right? They take the knowledge that we produce, right, to try and see whether they can use it to predict what might be happening. But it's essentially future-oriented activity. So there's a sort of a grounded element, but you're trying to build into the future. So that's why I was talking about imagining sort of structured imagination, right? A disciplined imagination where you create possibilities, right? That they're not yet there, and those become relationships, and those relationships can be evaluated today. And if they're desirable, well, you move in that direction. You need to give them this sort of a self-propelling mechanism to be able to turn it into action. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, someone put here that Goshel's paper. There are many of those, right? So bad management theories are destroying good management practice, and there's loads, right? So there's tourist work on the crisis management studies, and I guess the conclusion is bad theories, and I guess we've narrowed that down into, well, perhaps we have too many theories, right? The micro theories, they're not adding anything relevant, and inevitably we end up in a situation where theory is wrong, right? Somehow, at least when it comes to impact, at least when it comes to influencing practice, right? There's something wrong with theory. We say, well, no, I guess there's something wrong in how we evaluate theory and what we use theory for, right? So is a narrow emphasis on the evaluation of the value of theory rather than theory itself, right? So that's what we're at least trying to do here, because the theory still is relevant, right? So that's what we do. That's the core of our work. We explain the world in simple ways, right? Right. So there's Rosella.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation and the insights. My question is related to this creating meaningful spaces. And more specifically, I was interested in the slide where you explained the workshop and the interim thing. And I wanted to understand, besides creating a relationship, is here the purpose to still identify the problem, or is to actually do this and, as you said, mapping the intervention?
So you're going from, I mean, this is a share understanding. So this is our domain. This is what we're working in, right? So in our case, entrepreneurship and well-being. That's essentially the domain. Okay, let's have a look at what we know about it. So we now that we're in the same space, at least knowledge space, when we go one level down and start sharing experiences, and where are we coming from, right? So then we realize that there have entrepreneurs in this story of history of depression, autism, bipolar disorder. So, well, there's something, right? There's a reason why we are here and we're interested in doing research in this space and trying to contribute to knowledge and practice in that domain. So there's a space of empathy, right? So there are common denominators at the level of experience, right? The level of emotions. And then you go down to the level, and those common denominators, essentially what you start kind of looking into is specific relationships, right? So we start kind of thinking about anxiety, self-worth, right? And things that we feel that they're relevant and in our practice, in theory, or there's something missing in the literature, right? That could eventually solve problems that they're seeing, experiencing in practice. Then we did quick rounds of data collection. So we all did interviews and trying to capture wider reality, right? So other entrepreneurs experience the same to refine our understanding of problems and what might be missing in the literature, right? So it's all get sort of overlaps, if you like, right? And then you go, we're taking it down to the level of shared will, right? So a sense of common direction, because you need to give them thrust, right? So we have that mental model where we all agree that this is how anxiety provokes this and this behaves with that, right? And this is missing in that relationship is nowhere to be seen in the literature, right? So if we manage to solve that problem, right? So solve that and develop an understanding of that relationship that we're seeing that is missing, we can actually develop knowledge and contribute to practice at the same time. But then when that becomes a blueprint, right? So a common model for impact oriented research, if you like, right? So you need to move to the level of desire, right? We want to solve this problem, right? This is something that we need to act upon, and that becomes part of the research. But it's not something that you do afterwards, right? Or someone will do afterwards. I'll throw my research out there, someone will take it into something with it. No, that becomes part of research. So you move from share emotions, share experiences, and that sort of a space of empathy to give energy to the group and say, okay, what is it that we want to do, right? What is the if then possibility we want to trigger? We're going to evaluate it, and then we're going to try to implement it. So those are the elements of our mutually meaningful space, right? It's not just relationships, but you have to take it down to the point where you say, we want to change things. We want to use knowledge production as a way of changing it. From theory development, in that sense, as a way of changing it.
Thank you.
Welcome.